Chapter 28. Easy, take it easy. Her wild laughter morphed into sobs. She heard Mac's voice through her tears. She excused herself and ducked into the bathroom while Muggs greeted the newcomer. There she turned on the cold water and splashed her face, patting down the tears. When she was composed enough to face him, she walked into the kitchen, sat down and very quietly said, "I'm sorry." Muggs nudged his nose against her leg. She reached down to stroke his big ears, wondering what Mac must think of her. He looked at her in surprise. "Why? You've come across 2 dead bodies, one in your own backyard, and may have found a conspiracy involving the third, all within your first 4 days here in Mission." He shook his head. Anybody who's not in law enforcement or the medical profession would have the same kind of reaction. She nodded, but it didn't help very much. She didn't want to be just anybody. She craved to be somebody special, to be somebody different. She'd been just a wife for so long, and now she was an individual person, in her own space. But what did that mean? Who was she? She wasn't sure what to do now in her life. She felt lost in the brand new scheme of things as her daily events unfolded here in Mission. She could only hope she'd find out who she was soon enough. She picked up the coffee cup Mac had filled for her and took a big drink. Then she hugged the cup with both hands. "Did you find any connection between the men?" "Not yet, but if it's there, I'll find it. We do take murder very seriously here." She nodded. "Mr. De Gennaro said Alice Feldspar, Jeremy's wife, is a resident at Rosemore. Maybe I should ask around at the retirement home or speak to her directly." "No." He glared at her. "I'll take care of that. What is your problem? Just leave it alone, please." Doreen glared back. At least she no longer felt like crying. "How can I just sit here and do nothing? The least I can do is talk to people, find out information and feed it to you. Unless you want me to go off and find the killer myself." "You just did find out info and feed it to me. The Alice Feldspar lead. And hell no, I don't want you to go off and find the killer yourself. How would you even know who the killer is at this point? And what would you do? Just walk up to some suspect and ask him if he committed 2 murders recently? You realize somebody has killed 2 men in 2 weeks, possibly the third from as many decades ago. If it wasn't you and it wasn't Nan, chances are it'll be somebody who Nan knows, possibly very well. It could even be somebody who you know. This is a small town community. Sure, the city itself is big, but this area that we live in, it's small, it's tight, and everybody knows each other. You can't take the chance of pissing off the wrong person. Neither can you take the chance of tipping off the person who did this." She sat back, disgruntled. Muggs looked up at her from his spot on the floor, then dropped his head down again. Doreen finally nodded. "Okay." He stared at her as if waiting to see if she really understood. "Now let's get your police statement started." He pulled out his notepad and pen, but also set a handheld tape recorder on the kitchen table and hit the record button. "What made you go in that direction coming home?" She frowned at him. "I was just looking for a path along the creek. It's pretty back there. I wasn't looking for the missing man." "How did you know he was missing?" he asked, a hint of suspicion in his voice. She gave him a drawn look. "I didn't kill him." He rolled his eyes. "Just answer the question, please." She nodded. "Nan told me about it." "And by sheer accident you went in that direction? Just a coincidence that you stumbled over the second body?" "Absolutely." It sounded a little thin to her ears too. He studied her for a long moment and then nodded. "Okay, so you went directly from the retirement home toward this creek path?" She shook her head. She gave him as many of the details as she could remember about the convoluted way she came home. I was just walking aimlessly exploring. I don't know the area. I thought I'd walk around and see something new about the town. I came upon the creek, crossed it, and kept going. I figured I would end up at home if I kept walking in this direction. I saw the cul-de-sac beside ours. She nodded toward the houses she could see out the back window. The two cul-de-sacs were kind of in a cloverleaf pattern. I knew I wasn't very far away from home. How did you recognize the cul-de-sacs? Only one house in both of these cul-de-sacs has those big Spanish tiles on the roof, she said quietly. I do observe things, you know. He wrote down some notes. So what made you see him in the first place? Muggs. Right, the dog. But not right away. He raised his head and looked at her again. Why not right away? We were sitting on a log maybe 10 yards from where the body was. I was enjoying the rest, thinking how beautiful the spot was and how absolutely lovely the town is to live in. That Nan had made a wonderful decision in spending as much of her life here as she had. Muggs wasn't bothered? Muggs lifted his head at the sound of his name. She stroked his body with her foot and shook her head. There had been a nice breeze up until then. It came more from across the river. But when a big gust of wind came downriver, then Muggs barked like crazy. Up until then, I think he was just tired and sleeping. And then what did you do? She looked at Mac in surprise. I stood, and the three of us walked the creek toward home. Muggs was still barking like crazy, and he didn't stop until we approached the body. I could see that the man was dead, just lying there in the water. Mac finished writing down another note, looked back at her and said, "And then what?" She raised both hands in frustration. What do you mean, and then what? I called you. That's what. You didn't check out the man's pockets? Did you move him? Touch the man in any way? Check to see if he was alive? She stared at Mac in horror. He was in the water. Face down but slightly twisted to the side. Dirt was in his mouth from the water washing around his face. His eyes were open. I didn't think there was any chance he was still alive. And no, I did not touch him. I did not go through his pockets. She still stared at Mac. I can't believe you'd ask me that. Check my shoes. They are dry. Upset, but not letting him get to her any further, she continued, and then I walked back and forth. I felt like I was being watched, just kind of an odd feeling, like I had to be protective of the body, and I was afraid that somebody would come along before you got there. I had been in that area on Thursday. I had actually found the same path, but starting from the house. A boy had climbed one of the big trees. I didn't want him to come along today and see the body. She glared at Mac. And you said you'd be there in 10 minutes. But you were 30 minutes getting there. It was his turn to roll his eyes at her. Sorry. I came as fast as I could. Yeah, right. What? A dead body wasn't priority enough? I was getting a team together, so I wasn't the only one arriving. Also, I had to figure out exactly where you were. Your general directions were not very good. He reached over and shut off the recorder. Whatever. She finished her coffee, rising to pick up the pot. This is becoming quite a habit. One I hope you will break. She froze, coffee pot in hand, and stared at him. What are you talking about? Your habit of finding dead bodies. Oh. Relief washed over her. She waved the coffee pot around slightly. I was talking about you coming here for coffee is becoming a habit. A good one to break. He grinned, chuckled, and then laughed a great big belly laugh that roared through the kitchen. She filled his coffee cup. It's not that funny. He gasped and tried to regain his breath. Actually, yes, it is pretty funny. I intended to cut back on my coffee habit. But it's worse now because I'm always here. That's not my fault, she protested, but it was hard not to grin. How about you just solve these murders? That would make my life a lot easier. Although I do have a theory, if you want to hear it. What is it? She broached the subject carefully, leaning forward. You know, I've been giving this a lot of thought. I was thinking about the man who disappeared decades ago. I think somebody in this area probably murdered him, and I think the recently murdered 2 men were related to him. They were probably looking for his killer. Wow. That's quite a theory. Any evidence to back that up? He asked in a mocking tone, but with a smile on his face, letting her know that it wasn't a taunt, more like a casual teasing remark. I'm not into conspiracy theories, she said. Honest. It just seems like all this has to be related. And I thought I saw a family resemblance. She glanced over at her laptop and then back at him. I have some photos. At his headshake, she got mad. I did this before you arrived, so you can't get upset with me. Muggs sat up and woofed. It's okay, boy, he's just being difficult. He glared at her. She sighed. Okay. I also sent them to you. Did you get them? No, I didn't. However, I have a lot of messages here. Some of us work for a living, you know. Some of us are trying to find a job so we can make a living, you know? She grabbed her laptop and brought up the pictures of Robert and James that she had put side by side in profile. This is what I found. Do you see the resemblance in these? He leaned forward and studied the images. You know something? You could be right. He glanced at her in surprise. She beamed. So I'm not such a foolish old lady after all. You're not old at all. Pleased, she brushed past how he failed to say she wasn't foolish either and said, What I need is a photo of the man who went missing decades ago. Something in profile that might show features to match these 2 men. There should be some in the archives, he said. Send those to my email again. I'll check for myself. She brought up her email program, typed in his email address, and sent off the photos as an attachment. When she was done, she sat back. Can you send me the other photo when you find it? She added the last bit hurriedly. He gave her that long stare. Remember, it's official business. She gave him a long stare right back. Remember, I'm not a suspect. He chuckled. You have to admit I've been some help, haven't I? Maybe. Or maybe you're taking up a lot of official resources, sending me off on a wild goose chase. Maybe you're a Photoshop magician and just made these photos look like this. She stared at him in shock. Why would I possibly do that? She looked at the photos. Can people do that? Way too often people do that. He glanced at her. You don't actually think those models on the magazine covers look like that, do you? She considered the question. I never really gave that much thought. But I know my husband believed them to look just like that. Ouch. That would be a hard thing to live up to, because it's not something you can live up to. Those photos aren't real. All those images have been fixed to make the women look better. She studied him. But who determines what is better? He grinned. Exactly the problem.